Grand Theft Auto 5 is one of the most played games of all time with a huge player base and obviously a huge map called Los Santos, which is filled with a bunch of buildings and places. Despite this game being released in 2013, it still holds up with today's graphic standards. But what if I tried recreating these buildings in 3D software with 2021 graphic standards? What's up guys, this is me, Dime. And this is my friend Bunny, and we're currently in the process of shooting textures. Because Rockstar uses their own textures, and so are we.
Fuck loans. 50k out to a nigga rolling as a brittle figure. Wonder why you're trying to throw stones. I know many fabricated on and feeling obligated. What the proof is on my 4 phones. I like every single crap.
And now that I'm done with taking these shots, editing them, and turning them into textures, it's time to get started on modeling. And the very first thing I do is download a reference photo and open it in FSpy, which is a great program for perspective extraction. You just put a couple of reference points here and there, import it in Blender, and boom, you got your camera set up exactly where you need it. Obviously starting with the most basic shapes first because it gives us something to work with later on. The same thing is happening here, blocking out every prop I can think of, copy-pasting the props just so I can get the feeling of the scene as soon as possible. This staircase, for example, that I'm modeling here is again only a basic shape build which will later be replaced by a higher detail, better looking staircase. And of course, steps on staircases are something you'd expect to see on a staircase, so we're modeling those as well as the handles. I'm just making sure here that everything has proper dimensions, and later if something seems off, we can fix it. First, you need to learn the rules in order to break them. I'm using a simple array modifier tool to duplicate the stairs accordingly, and I thought that now is the best time to slowly start adding some textured materials, which were mostly captured by me, but in some cases you'll see some textures that I just forgot to capture and found them online, but most of the textures are homemade or whatever you'd like to call them. Adding a paint mask as a factor to a mix shader node is one of the easiest way to achieve realistic looking materials. Now I just want to focus on the roof and the structure that supports it, and at this point, when your goal is to add more detail, you want to experiment as much as possible, and bear in mind that most of the times, the detail you see does not mean a lot of complicated geometry, but just a lot of square shapes next to each other, which will be shown here in a second. So now that I built the structure, I went to GIMP and fixed some of the textures to tile better. Then we unwrap the textures onto the mesh and start painting the rust material over it. And let's not forget the screws. You can never forget the screws. They're so easy to make and yet add so much to the prop you're making. Just don't overscrew something. Sometimes you want to deform and destroy your prop to make it look more believable. You're never going to see a perfect object in the real world, so why would you make one in 3D? I decided to deform it a little just to add that sort of wear and tear look. And then I made a mid-poly model which I baked onto a low-poly model to make the texture look 3D. Then I started working on the lamp, and funny enough, I didn't have a lamp texture for this prop, but I did not want to download one, so I just used the one I captured of the air conditioner and managed to make it work with some rust. Just covered the edges to make them look worn out, and honestly, I was super satisfied with how it turned out, considering the texture I used. One more thing that is super simple to add, and it adds to the scene so much, is organic things like a cable. Is a cable organic? I'm not sure, but it helps out a lot. So I added a curve and enabled the depth option to make it look thick. Took a cube basically and turned it into a duct tape, which makes it look as if it's holding the cable from falling down. I started painting the walls with light brown rust material. I added a transparent cable images, which are groundbreaking discovery for me at least, because they look so good and are so simple to make. I added these caution signs because you gotta be careful, and obviously added some low poly screws to hold them onto the wall. After that, I decided to make an electric housing box that will power the garage door, and again, I used the air conditioner texture for the normal map. Then I added a garage door and started texturing it properly, and then I messed with the nose to make the color look more like the one you see in the game. Downloaded a Los Santos Customs logo and applied it to the garage door, and then I used a noise texture to make it look scratched. And finally, I brushed the whole thing with a metal material. Next, I found this PBR ground material on Polyhaven and decided to use it for this project. Then I took another mud material and painted all the edges in order to add vegetation there. And the transition from the asphalt to the mud was just a darker asphalt texture to make it look as if the person who did the asphalt did a very bad job. Next up, I was just placing some PNG images of the grass. I took an image of an electric box and tried my best to turn it into a decent looking prop, and bear in mind that I'm extremely cautious about the poly count, hence the reason I don't make some of the props super round and detailed, like the screws for example. That sounds like a perfect excuse when I'm modeling anything. I went into some detail trying to make the lids 3D as well as the bolts. After all of that was done, I made support for the whole thing and added a couple of PNG cables here and there. As you can see, there's not much science going on when creating these vegetation props, especially when it's not something that's going to be zoomed in. But if you want your grass to be more detailed, just add more loop cuts and more duplicates of the image facing different directions. Here comes the part where I take the giant block and make it super high poly. Sculpt it using some brushes to make it look worn out, and then bake it onto a low poly mesh, and it turned out pretty good as well. Then I'm proud to say I used my own texture for concrete and started adding some dirt for the ground, because obviously there will be more dirt if you go closer to the ground, and you can see me applying this rule to almost anything I paint. If you're going to do the same, bear in mind how something would react to the environment, to the weather as time goes on. For example, metal would rust and paint would lose its color, concrete would crack, glass would become less see-through, and so on. Now it's up to you to decide where that concrete would crack. For me, it made sense to crack at the very edges close to the wall because that's where I'm used to seeing it. But we will talk about wear and tear in materials in the future videos. Here I just did the same thing as before, sculpted a high poly model and baked it onto a low poly mesh, added some fake concrete cracks. Then I started texturing the pipes and added some more detail to them, like connecting points and screws. Talking about those screws, I started adding them to the signs that are on the walls and then destroyed those signs with some paint. Next up was turning the base stairs model into an actual final model. It was actually really simple. I just extruded a couple of parts, added some materials, and that's it. Adding this door was nothing too fancy. I just literally had an image of a door, so I just imported it and added some 3D depth to it, like a door frame, and later I'll add a handle as well. I promise. I opened up GIMP and started making the original banner you see in the game. I did not want to change anything, so I just replicated it as the best as I can. And after importing it to Blender, the only thing that was left to do was to add a deforming metal normal map, scratch it, and then add rust. And then while making this lamp, I used the air conditioner texture again. I imported the reference images I got from GTA 5, as you can see in the corner here, and started redesigning the base stairs I made at the very beginning of this project, and I just copied the steps from the smaller stairs we made and altered their scale. After placing them, I decided to make a custom material using a metal texture, which I plugged into a mixed RGB, and changed the lightest and the darkest colors and went with this green material, and then, surprise surprise, I added rust. How unexpected, come on. The top part was obviously easier considering it had 6 faces, but the process was pretty much the same. I duplicated it and added a guardrail and finally added some support and again some screws. After that, I started making the container. As always, we got our reference images loaded in, and this is the first time I discovered how the garbage trucks pick them up. It's with these things at the side. Honestly, I've never thought of that. But anyways, I made some basic feet with the container and added a system for opening and closing the lid, and then I started modeling the lid. I remembered that a container has a handle, which was super easy to make. I'm making the edges rusty, and you will see I'll add a metallic material which will really add a lot to the prop. Obviously these things at the side are used the most, so we make them worn out the most. And to finish off, you'll never guess what I did. That's right, I added rust. No, but seriously, I went over it with a metal brush to show you that the colors are peeling off and to show you that this container has been on the streets for quite some time, because This is Los Angeles we're talking about. And now, you could say my favorite part, making parking lines. I made these white guides to help me draw the lines consistently, and at first I forgot to use the line paint tool, but thankfully soon after I remembered. If anyone is wondering how I made the lines material, I just took the normal map from the asphalt texture and made the color yellow. And also while making this, I realized how similar it is to miniature modeling in real life. Obviously doing modeling in real life would be much harder for me, so I'm sticking to 3D, but I'm definitely open to try something out if you guys want to see that sort of content. This is where I decided I'll make a window and interior behind that window just to show that this building is not made out of 3mm cardboard, but is in fact a real building with rooms inside, which it isn't by the way, but it just sells that story very well. And this is the texture we captured, and it turned out pretty good. Bear in mind that these textures had to be manipulated in a lot of ways to make them tile seamlessly, but if you want a tutorial on how to extract textures from real world and make them look realistic and stuff, I am more than happy to make a video explaining how it's done. Then finishing up with the Los Santos logo placement, I started painting the other walls with dust and dirt. I'm just tinkering with a couple of things here and there, but don't mind that. And again, adding these cable images because I got obsessed with them. Then it was time to make the final wall shine, and when I say shine, I mean completely destroy it and add electronics onto it. I used GIMP to make the normal map and imported the image into Blender, from where I started turning it into a 3D prop. I actually downloaded a bunch of images online like this one because sometimes you just don't get enough textures outside, and by the way, all of these props, all of them, will be included on my brand new Patreon tier called Props for $5, where I will be uploading 16 to 20 high quality props per month. Alright, enough of self-promotion, it's time to model the vents, and this was actually very easy to do as you would think, and I was thinking of adding normal map instead of the geometry, but I just couldn't be bothered with that. Also made some screws and applied them across the vents, and finally added something to hold everything together. And just like in real life, made some leaking rust going under the vents and the air conditioners. And now that we're finishing everything up finally, I added some sort of a tile texture that I proudly captured myself. I made a little gap here so people can actually climb up the ladder, and after doing all of those logical things, I started doing the illogical things like adding this pipe and then moving the garage door up there. And then from some of my older projects, I took some of the props that I made and spread them across the current project. Of course, some props had to be made like this fruit box or whatever you want to call it, but the process was very simple. Just make a few holes in a box and apply a simple texture with little holes in it, which we made in GIMP. I was actually really happy with how it turned out, and I started filling them with a bunch of crap I found across the scene. And for more realism, I added more electrical stuff, but despite me being sarcastic, and it actually worked really well. I took the tires from the Audi A7 that I modeled,
available on my Patreon, link is in the description,
and stacked them in front of the store. And finally added some buildings in the distance to add more depth to the scene. I keep saying finally, but there's always more things going on. Anyways, I think this is the final thing I did, where I added these rusty holders for wires, but it was a great idea actually because it filled up the empty space that we had there. You can see how I'm using anything from every single project I had currently to make this look the best as I can. Oh yeah, and finally I downloaded a Franklin model, I rigged it, and yeah, that turned out okay. But now that we're done, I think it's time for you to see the final render. It's time to get started on 2,000 subscribers. We're only 500 away. It's not a lot, you know, it's like a couple of people. What do I know? I mean, you know, take care.